What is society? Is it a real thing that exists out there in the world, or is it just an abstract label we put on a collection of other people out there? If so, what do we mean when we talk about different societies? And what do people mean when they say society says X or Y is wrong? Sometimes people say that we live in a sick society. But can society really be sick or healthy? It sounds like people are talking about a person or some entity with a will of its own that is capable of influencing or even forcing people to do what it wants. So the question is society a thing? One man who had answers to those questions was the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, who lived and worked around the turn of the 20th century. This video series is an introduction and overview of the rules of the sociological method written by Emile Durkheim in 1895. It is one of my favorite sociology books because it was one of the first and most comprehensive attempts at defining sociology as a science. It is fairly easy to read, systematic, and it's written with a great passion that you don't always find in the often dry styles of social theory writers. When that is said, it is by no means an easy book. Granted, Durkheim's style is much more to the point than many other important sociologists. But the thing is, Durkheim delves into some fairly deep and fundamental questions, and the book may be a challenge for beginner sociologists. I'm not going to comment on the book line by line, but rather present its general ideas in roughly the same order as Durkheim writes about them. I would recommend that you go and get a hold of a copy for yourselves. Links will be provided in the description. Now, Durkheim was a believer in science. He wanted to make sociology into a real science and not just philosophical speculation on society. For Durkheim, science meant having a rigorous methodology, making theories based on the observation of the world and testing your theories by subjecting them to empirical data. But most importantly, he treats society as a fact. In fact, Durkheim saw sociology as a part of the life sciences. Biology, psychology and sociology would each study different aspects of human life, or rather they would study life on different levels of complexity. This idea of sciences studying different layers of complexity is sometimes referred to as general systems theory. Let me talk about that for a minute. For systems theorists like Durkheim, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Think about it this way. A rabbit bouncing around in the meadow is clearly a living thing, but if you put that rabbit into a blender and push the button, it is no longer alive, obviously. It is indeed difficult to even call that bloody smoothie a rabbit at all, although it might still taste delicious. But the point is, even though it contains all the same material of a rabbit, its rabbitness, so to speak, has more to do with how those parts are organized in relation to each other than the parts that it's made up of. The rabbit is therefore an emergent property because it's something that emerges from the interactions of the cells and organs. A biological organism. Speaking of blood and gore, the words organ and organism are interesting here because when Durkheim talks about society, he sometimes uses the organic metaphor. Different institutions in society are like organs of a body, each one having separate functions needed to keep society together. We will come back to the organic metaphor when we start talking about one of Durkheim's other books, which is called The Division of Labor in Society. Going back to general systems theory, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a set of concentric rings, where the inner layer is physics. Then the next layer is chemistry, followed by biology, then psychology, and finally sociology. You can see these aspects of the world as a ladder of increasing complexity. Chemistry ultimately reduces to physics, and physical interactions give rise to chemical processes. Likewise, biological life emerges from biochemical processes, and brains create individual personalities. The interactions between individuals create families, organizations, and countries. So you see, each science has an object of study depending on the level of complexity it analyzes. For Durkheim's three life sciences, these are as follows. Biology studies biological facts, cells, organisms, ecosystems. Psychology studies psychological facts, cognition, behavior, personality. And so, sociology studies social facts, roles, norms, the law, institutions. For Durkheim, therefore, the study of society was of social facts. Social phenomena have a different qualitative characteristics than psychological and biological facts. Of course, these three sciences have things in common. Sociologists can learn a great deal from psychology and biology, especially social psychology, evolutionary psychology, and neuroscience. But you cannot reduce downwards. You cannot explain norms, legal codes, family structure, nation states, crime and punishment, political parties, patterns of migration, or social evolution from psychological models. Social facts are irreducible to psychological and biological phenomena. The evolution of societies follow different rules than the evolution of animals or the history of ideas, because it operates on a higher level of complexity. But how does this make sociology a science with a capital S? And yes, Durkheim was being very insistent that social facts were real as in objective and as things. They're not just subjective representations depending on anyone's opinion. They exist out there in the world. Of course, they do not have an essential existence. They're not unchangeable universal substances. If all humans died out tomorrow, there would no longer be any social facts. Nevertheless, social facts have an objective reality. And yes, society does depend on there being individual to create it. But then again, individual personalities can only exist if there are biological brains to create them. But as we learn from general systems theory, the higher level of complexity is an emergent property which is something different than the parts which they are made up of. Now when I say objective, I don't mean tangible or material reality. They are not material things. But a real thing does not have to be made up of matter. A national border is obviously a social thing. It is an arrangement that is created by society, not some arbitrary geographical features, although they may have played some part in the genesis. But who would dispute that the national border is a real thing? If you think it is, then why not try to go through a border control with a shopping cart filled with 100 cartons of cigarettes? But before we look at what makes social facts real and objective, we have to ask the question, what is a social fact? What makes certain phenomena social? Is everything that happens in society a social fact? Is a person going to the bathroom a social activity? Clearly not. Acts like these are more biological than sociological. Yes, everybody poops, but pooping is usually a solitary activity, at least in my experience. What makes something social has to do with the interaction between people. People do things in relation to each other. Durkheim's first example is the notion of duties and roles. People act on their duties as a sister, as a father, as a part of an organization, or as a citizen. If we look at the three life sciences again, biological facts are certainly objective, psychological facts seem less so, and social facts appear to be the least objective of all. Duties, on the face of it, seem kind of subjective, something going on in your mind. But what does it really mean to be objective? The opposite of objective is subjective. Social facts are forces outside the subjective mind of the individual. It is something external to the individual that compels them to conform or face sanctions from the collective society around them. Social things are real and objective because they exist outside of and have consequences on the individual. You may think that this sounds kind of arbitrary, like some kind of linguistic trick. Just because something isn't a purely solipsistic phenomenon of the individual mind, does that mean that it is objective? Let's dig deeper and look into another social phenomenon, crime. The proper way of understanding what makes crime a social fact is thus not to look inward into what you yourself think should be a crime. In some societies, adultery or homosexuality is a crime. You might disagree with that, but as long as it is being punished in some society, it is objectively a crime in that society. Durkheim applies the same to morality. Sociologically speaking, what is moral is not up to the opinion of the researcher. She is a product of her own society. What is deemed moral or immoral depends on which part of the world you are in, and what historical time period it is. Social facts are the product of the societies that they arise from. They're indeed real things, but they're not eternal or unchangeable. The point is that as a sociologist, you have to be kind of a moral relativist, even though you don't have to be that personally. But you have to understand society as a scientist, where you don't let your own opinions influence what you see and study. The trouble with understanding how social facts are real is because you yourself live in society. People everywhere have an everyday experience of society, and they have interests and agendas of how society should run. The point of sociology is to take a step back from your own subjective experiences and interests and see what society really is. It is a collective phenomenon, and it exists independently of you, whether you like it or not. You have to leave your personal feelings behind and study societies like a scientist would study a colony of bacteria. Social facts are around us and compel us to do things, but they are at the same time part of us, and we are a small piece of an enormous network of social relations communicating with each other, creating this thing we call society. The fact that you don't always notice these social forces is because you have been conditioned throughout your life to act according to what is expected of you. Durkheim contends that people, through their education and their interactions throughout life, attain habits of interaction that help society function smoothly. It is when you try to go against these duties, norms, roles, and laws that they will feel like real things. If you actively try to breach a social norm or act in defiance of the law, you will quickly be struck down by society. So, what characterizes social facts are coercion and conformity. And you only really feel the coercion when you try to deviate from them. Deviant actions are punished by society. Crimes are a good example of social things. They exist independently of the will of individual persons. Yes, legislators and judges might have something to do with their creation, but in society they have a life of their own. But of course, not all deviant actions are considered crimes. Every individual goes through society with constant surveillance made by the public conscience. Punishment may be more informal. Sometimes you may be ostracized by your family and friends, sometimes merely ridiculed, like that time you walked naked around in the street. Social distance can be as bad as any penalty by the law. The reason is that society is also something that enables people to do things and fulfill their individual desires. The sociologist Anthony Giddens stated that the social structure from the perspective of individuals are rules and resources. You have to follow the rules, but you can benefit from its resources. In order to get food, you have to go to the shop and bring money and behave according to the norms of your role as a shopper. There has to be a network on logistics, transportation, employment relations, and economic transactions already there in place to make the food available for you to buy. And of course, you have to speak the same language. Indeed, there has to be a kind of social structure already there for you to use its resources, and that social structure is dependent on there already being conformity in society. There are also more informal relations that you can benefit from. Friends, family, business contacts. They can help you find the right people to talk to when you need something done. To sum up, sociology is the study of social facts. Social facts arise from the interaction between people. Though they are created by people, they are not dependent on individuals. They are a collective phenomenon and have an existence of their own. Just like molecules have different properties than the atoms that make them, society have a life of their own independent of the people that create them. Social facts are objective because they are forces outside your individual consciousness that drives people to conform with the rest of society. But in the end, it doesn't really matter if you don't like to use the word objective when dealing with social facts. You should treat Durkheim's worldview like one of many useful ways of understanding society. Maybe sociology will never be a science with a capital S, because people's desires, intentions, and individual wills are difficult variables to isolate and control. But Durkheim at least teaches us some humility in face with such a great force as society. It lives its own life and doesn't always do what you want it to do, so we treat it as such. Think of society like the weather. It's volatile and unpredictable. It is much greater than you and impossible for anyone to control. But there are methods in place to at least understand to some extent how it works. That, my friends, is what sociology is all about. See you next time.